The content you're about to hear may be graphic in nature. Listener discretion is advised. This is True Crime XS.
Well, now we're like on the back end of all of this, kind of winding things down. It feels strange when we do that because we record so many of these in a row. And then as we wind down, it means we're getting closer and closer to Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. And there's like some of these cases, there's just no way for them to be like, I guess, happy holidays cases, except from the perspective of, you know, some of these people got to go home.
Yeah, I'm definitely not trying to sell this as holiday cheer. That's not really the point. That would be an awful way to do it, right?
Yeah.
This is more of an informative binge of true crime stories you probably won't find anywhere else.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody's covered this one or not. This is one of those cases that when I look at it, like there's so many people involved that it ends up making me pretty angry. The case itself is really old. It's from 1949, and it's from what I would describe as like a completely different time. Even reading some of the elements that I recognize as modern elements, it feels like you've entered a time capsule and you're reading something. I hope it would be impossible today.
I think it would be. I do believe it would be impossible today. I feel like this is almost, it should have been almost impossible then. It was just such a bizarre situation. I say that, but I happen to know there's another similar story, but it was few and far between. But this is egregious.
I would say egregious is the right word. I definitely, reading this one, I had a really hard time like wrapping my head around this case. One of the things about this case is it's from 1949. So like right up front, there's a lot going on that from my perspective, I've never truly been able to wrap my head around like what were people thinking. We have four main people here, and they're accused of something pretty egregious. The first person we have is a guy named Charles Greenlee. He was born in Florida in June of 1933. He is the son of Thomas and Emma Greenlee, who were born in Georgia and Alabama, respectively. If you go and read about this case, there's a lot of summaries about it, even though it's that far back in time. They had moved around Florida meaning his family, when he was very young. His father had worked as a laborer. He had worked in manufacturing I've read one place that he worked in a paint factory, and another place specified that it was a turpentine factory. Most of the sources for this that you'll find online are actually court documents and this flurry of articles between 2020 and 2024. The BBC, they talk about all of these guys. There's a book out there by a guy named Gilbert King. For those of you who don't know who Gilbert King is, he has an absolutely fascinating podcast if you want to go down sort of a different rabbit hole called Bone Valley. He did a lot of good in that case very recently, but he wrote a book and it was released in 2012 called Devil in the Grove, and it is about the story that we're talking about today. There's no specific sources for this. There's no specific sources for this. There's a really well-made Wikipedia page for this that you can find out there. It's one of those cases that we hear a lot about and they feel really distant. This is not even 100 years ago that this is happening. So picking up with Charles Greenlee, he's got four siblings. We've seen records based on like what the court presents about Charles and his family that all of his siblings in the 40s were in school. So Charles would have been around 12 years old, and he had four other siblings. In 1949, he came to an area called Groveland. He was looking for work. He was married, just about to turn 26 years old when he moves. His wife was pregnant at the time. We have another young man with him named Walter Irvin. He's born in 1927. He's about 6 years older than Charles Greenlee. He was living in Groveland, and we know this, not just based on the court records, but we know that he had a draft record in Groveland in May of 1945, so a couple of years before the incidents we're going to talk about. He listed his mother, Ella, or Elia, depending on which document you read, as his next of kin. And he was working at the time in Apshawa Groves. He's a little guy. According to 1945 records, he would have been 18 years old. He was 5 feet 3 inches tall and 105 pounds. His registration describes him as being a lighter brown with brown eyes and black hair. That's his draft registration that we're talking about. He did serve in the United States Army as a private. The third person that we're bringing in today was born around the same time that Walter Irvin was. His name is Samuel Shepard. He had been born up in Georgia, and his family had moved south down to Groveland, Florida. His dad worked in the lumber industry and in the timber industry. His dad ended up clearing and developing some former swampland around Groveland, and he owned his own farm. Now, we also have a draft card for Sam Shepard. He is registered as 5'8", 149 pounds, also light brown with brown eyes and black hair. And that's a 1945 registration as well when he turned 18 years old. This is like the old version of what's known as a selective service card. His dad, Henry, is his next of kin on his card. Now, Shepard and Irvin, so Walter and Sam, they knew each other. They both were veterans, and they stayed friends after World War II. Now, Ernest Thompson is the fourth of our bunch. We don't know as much about him. We do know he was married and that he lived and worked near Groveland. And we know that he knew Charles Greenlee. He had encouraged Charles to come to Groveland because in Groveland, they could work the citrus groves to make money. Now, when Samuel and Walter get out of the military and they go back home, they would wear their uniforms around. They were very proud of being veterans, and some of the people in the area didn't care for it. The sheriff at the time was a guy named Willis McCall. He was known for supporting continued segregation, meaning white people are here and they use these things, and black people are here and they use these things, and the services are all separated. He was sort of a law and order sheriff, but he was also heavily racist. He did not care for union organizing in his area, and he wanted his town and county to continue to survive on the idea of, they're going to work in these Florida citrus groves forever. He became a little bit corrupt from the perspective of almost organized crime because he would use different ways to get inmates involved in manning the orange groves when he could. Now, Samuel Shepard, he worked with his dad on his farm. Walter Irvin, as a vet living in Groveland, he was determined to find a way out of these orange groves. Now, we have a very small summary of the events surrounding this before we get into the crime and what happened. So I'm just going to run with them. If you have questions, let me know. So we have Ernest Charles, who by all accounts is 16 years old, Samuel, who's 22 at the time, and Walter, who's 22 at the time. They're in this area, and there is an attack on a woman. It's a white woman, and that becomes a really big deal for Groveland. According to what we've been told, and I'm not using her name. She is mentioned elsewhere. If you guys want to go find it, that's totally fine. She basically says that she was assaulted, raped by 4 black men. If you read the court documents on this, they're very brief. I couldn't tell you what the evidence is. I can tell you what is said in sort of the appellate documents, but again, they point out that they're not clear on the record because the transcripts are mostly incomplete. In July of 1949, these 4 men are accused of not only raping this white woman, but beating her husband almost to death. This is Lake County, Florida. So Ernest Thomas is described as the oldest. Allegedly, he was trying to get away from being captured. And by all accounts, even though he is married, living here, working here, has established his home here. He is alleged to have fled. And the way that's told to us is Charles Greenlee is working here. He had come in from Gainesville. He is friends with Ernest Thomas, which is weird because Ernest is the oldest, Charles is the youngest. But Ernest had convinced Charles that there would be a lot of work here. Charles is waiting at a rail depot and Thomas picks him up. Charles is immediately arrested and brought to the police station under suspicion of having had something to do with this rape and this beating of this wife and husband. So Charles is literally thrown into a cell. He is interrogated throughout the night. He is beaten until he gives a level of confession to the rape of this white woman. Ernest Thomas is wanted to be brought in, but he escapes the area. From the accounts by the sheriff, he had fled Lake County. And according to Charles's story that he tells the sheriff, he had been with Ernest. Police learn where he lived. They figure out over time where he's hiding. And they find a letter in his letterbox that is addressed to his wife. Willis McCall, he appoints a posse of more than 1,000 armed men. They go 200 miles away to Madison County, Florida. They find Ernest in the swamp and they chase him. And I'm going to say this, I don't have a way to verify it. I have a way that has been repeated over the years, kind of like a game of telephone. But it is reported that Ernest is shot 400 times and dies of those wounds. The officers write up reports and they say that Ernest was armed and he was reaching for a weapon. According to a coroner's inquest in Madison County, Florida, Lake County Sheriff McCall was at the scene when Thomas died. The coroner's jury determined that Thomas's death was lawful and they ruled his death a justifiable homicide. I don't know how you feel about that one. 400 times.
It's ridiculous. It's not justifiable. I mean, I don't see how anything was left.
Yeah. So in order to understand this whole story, we have to talk about Willis McCall. So Willis Virgil McCall, he's born July 21st of 1909. His early life is largely unknown, but it is known that he mainly lived in Lake County, Florida, and he was the son of a dirt farmer. That's the early days that we have. Everything that you read about him online, he's kind of this larger-than-life character. If you pick up a career summary of him, it basically says that he was first elected as sheriff of Lake County in 1944, and he defeated a guy named Emil Eade. Now, Emil was an interesting guy because he was a professional baseball player. He was specifically a pitcher, a left-handed pitcher that had played for the Pittsburgh Pirates, and he had played for the Detroit Tigers. He had led the National League in shutouts on a couple of occasions. So the two of them are, for some reason, up against each other in the Democratic Party primary in 1944. And I'll just say that the Democratic Party, even in Florida in 1944, is a very different Democratic Party than it was today. And you'll understand as I keep talking. Until 1972, Willis McCall just keeps being reelected as sheriff. I say all of that to say that the Groveland 4 incident that takes place in 1949, it happens very early in Willis McCall's, quote, career. If you read a physical description of him, he's well over 6 feet tall and more than 200 pounds. He's a big dude. He wore a big white felt hat, a black bolo tie, and he had polished boots. He won't be defeated until a guy named Guy Bliss runs for sheriff in 1972. Now, under his story, people tell this whole Groveland 4 a little bit different for years. This is a Democratic sheriff, throwing that out there. July 16, 1949, a 17-year-old married white woman in Groveland, Florida, said she'd been raped by 4 young black men and her husband had been beaten. And this is the Willis McCall version. The next day, 16-year-old Charles Greenlee, Sam Shepard, and Walter Irvin were arrested and jailed pending trial. They talk about the fact that Shepard and Irvin were Army veterans and that Sheriff McCall was out of state at the time, but he returned the next day. This case immediately made the newspapers, which was very rare in 1949. It gets national attention. And Willis McCall, after this case, will never leave the headlines of this area and is frequently getting national news coverage. We just talked about the fact Ernest Thomas had fled the county. He was avoiding arrest by the sheriff, and the posse had killed them up in Lake County. As word spread about what had happened to this 17-year-old girl, an angry crowd of white folk gather at the county jail in what is known as Tavares. It's the county seat of Lake County, Florida. These people, we don't know exactly how many are in the crowd, but it's quite a few people. They demanded that Willis McCall turn the suspects over to them and they'll take care of them. To Willis McCall's credit, which I don't give him a lot of credit, but I'll say a little credit, he had taken both Samuel Shepard and Walter Irvin, and he had stashed them in the basement of his home. He transferred them to a secluded cell in Rayford State Prison for what he described as their safety. So the mob headed down to Groveland, and they started rioting trying to find the suspects' families. By the third day, Willis McCall and multiple prominent businessmen from the area, they tell all the people in town, if they're black, they should leave. And most of them leave. At this point in time, McCall, Sheriff McCall, he calls the Florida governor and says he's going to need the National Guard. By the time National Guard troops arrive in the Groveland area, Samuel Shepard's house had already been burned to the ground among multiple other buildings. Willis McCall hands everything over to an attorney who is acting as the district attorney for the county. He gets a grand jury to indict these 3 remaining rape suspects because Ernest Thomas is dead. So reading in all of this, we don't have a really good point of view of what happened in the trial until it's looked at almost 60 years later. So everything I'm about to say, take it with a shaker of salt. During an FBI investigation, Samuel Shepard and Charles Greenlee, they tell the agents that deputies had beat them until they confessed to this crime. Later on, though, the U.S. attorney for the area, Herbert Phillips, he will not return indictments against the sheriff's deputies. They name them, though. One of them is named James Yates, and another one is named Leroy Campbell. Willis McCall becomes one of the big problems by going to the press and telling them before the trial that 2 of the men have confessed. So this is reported, and this is highlighted, and this is talked about on the front page of the newspapers above the fold. They put all 3 of them on trial separately, and their all-white juries quickly convict each of them. The judge who is overseeing these trials, he sentences Samuel Shepard and Walter Irvin to death. Because Greenlee was 16, means he's still a minor, he is sentenced to life in prison. It'll take 2 years, but in 1951, the U.S. Supreme Court is going to overturn Shepard and Irvin's convictions on the grounds that the black residents of the area had been improperly excluded from serving on the jury. Now, keep in mind, the state constitution at the time would still be under what was known as Jim Crow laws. So it's a discriminatory practice in general, but they were not allowed to vote. And if you couldn't vote, you couldn't sit on a jury. Supreme Court says no to that. In November of 1951, Willis McCall is transporting Samuel Shepard and Walter Irvin. He's supposed to bring them from Rayford State Prison to the county seat, Tavares, to the Lake County Jail for a retrial. He pulls off a country road. He claims that he had tire trouble. Now, in his sworn deposition, he says that Samuel Shepard and Charles Irvin attacked him in an escape attempt. He shot them both in self-defense while backing away from them. But Samuel Shepard and Walter Irvin are handcuffed together during the entire incident. Samuel Shepard is killed on the spot. Irvin was shot 3 times, but he survives. During this incident, Deputy James Yates, he arrives, and according to Walter Irvin, he stood over him and he shot him again while he was wounded. Ambulances arrive to the scene, and they take Willis McCall and Walter Irvin to Waterman Hospital in nearby Eustis. Willis McCall is treated for a concussion and facial injuries. Walter Irvin is treated for his gunshot wounds. At the hospital, Walter Irvin meets with lawyers from the NAACP. And later on, he tells the press that Willis McCall shot him and Shepard without provocation, and so did James Yates. Now, for Gilbert King's part, he reports that he looked through the unredacted FBI files on the case, and in the book that he wrote, He said that the FBI had located a bullet in the soil directly below the blood stain where Walter Irvin had lain wounded, and it supported Walter Irvin's claims that Yates fired at him while standing over at him looking down. A Lake County coroner's inquest concluded that Willis McCall had acted in the line of his duty, and a judge named Truman Futch, he ruled that he saw no need to impanel a grand jury related to this incident where Samuel Shepard lost his life and Walter Irvin was shot and almost lost his. After Walter recovers from the shooting, his retrial is moved out of Lake County to the north up to Marion County. So his retrial starts in November of 1952. He's offered a plea bargain. Walter Irvin says he can't plead guilty because he's innocent. The jury again finds Walter Irvin guilty, and again, the judge sentenced him to death. Now, the case is appealed. The conviction is upheld by the Florida courts and then eventually the Florida Supreme Court. And in early 1954, the United States Supreme Court declined to hear his case. Petitions are filed on behalf of Walter Irvin with the governor for clemency. The newly elected governor at the time is a man named Leroy Collins. Leroy Collins in 1955, he commutes Walter Irvin's sentence to life in prison. He says he does not believe that the state established guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. So we've been talking about Samuel Shepard. We've been talking about Walter Irvin. Ernest Thomas was dead. Charles Greenlee, he never appealed his case. In 1962, he's paroled. In 1968, Walter Irvin is finally paroled. Walter Irvin, in 1969, he goes down to visit Lake County, Florida. He dies while he's there. Charles Greenlee, just to contrast, he takes his wife and his daughter and they move to Tennessee. He has a son with his wife. He lives there until 2012.
You were talking about the all-white juries were very commonplace during the Jim Crow era, right?
Yeah.
Because basically Black people were just not allowed to sit. They would just be excused, right?
Correct.
If they were even able to be called.
Most of them weren't called, yeah.
As the civil rights movement was happening, I was going to see, I don't know exactly when this would have happened, but the reason that up until 2020, Louisiana and Oregon allowed for non-unanimous verdicts that resulted in convictions was specifically to allow for a couple of Black jurors to sit on the jury and the jury overall to still get a conviction.
Somehow, I did not know that.
Well, I didn't either. And that's why I wanted to share it, because I know that there's been, obviously most states require a unanimous verdict, right? If you can't
Correct.
come to a unanimous verdict, there's a mistrial and it has to be retried, or it basically starts over again. It's not like they just get let go because they couldn't come to a decision. That was a way that they got around, the thought process was, and I do not think this way, this is just the way that they thought then, if a Black person was on a jury, they would let a guilty Black person go. And so they're like, we can put a couple on the jury, and when they vote not guilty, it just doesn't count. And they upheld that all the way until, it was Ramos versus Louisiana in 2020, I believe, that basically was like, okay, this has got to stop, right? Because it's ridiculous. But I thought that was really interesting. I was aware that there were states that did that. I had no idea why.
Well, that is an interesting factor. I pulled, because there's more to the Groveland case. There's not a lot more, but I pulled together some stuff. It is summarized, if you can find it pretty easily. I would say that Gilbert's book is the best place to go if you're looking for a deep dive on this. There were a couple other things I pulled about Willis McCall that, in my opinion, are kind of linked to all of this and kind of the behavior at the time. The Ramos ruling is interesting. I had always wondered that. It's one of those things when you talk about the non-unanimous votes, particularly for guilt But like at some point in time, did that also apply to the death penalty or no?
There is something like that. Actually, I think it still applies to the death penalty. I think that without a unanimous finding for death in a capital case, it has to be life in prison if they go that route.
Those are some of those interesting facts that as we do these cases, I know this is Home for the Holidays series. It's a little different. It's not as deep a dive as we normally do. I will hear those things and I'll make a note of it in my phone to look those things up. I found a note recently where I guess maybe in the course of this or something else we were talking about, I had found something that was like, what juries don't have to be unanimous? Because like I never remember to look some of these little tidbits up because at this point in time, does everybody have to be unanimous now?
The idea behind Ramos versus Louisiana was the Supreme Court was saying, like, it doesn't satisfy the trial by jury to allow for somebody to be found guilty when the verdict is not unanimous. It implies the whole point of a jury trial is to take every single person's finding into consideration, right?
Yeah.
And so by negating the unanimous part, in some cases it was like as many as 2. Some I think were perhaps majority rules. It's so interesting. And you're right. It's hard to look into something like that when it comes up in a case where there's already so many other things going on, right? Like in this case. And it's just this little tidbit of information that what sparked my memory was the fact that these 3 young Black men were all tried by an all-white jury.
Yeah, that's always fascinating to me.
And that's now this was in 1949.
Right.
So that seems a little more right. Like some of the cases that I hear about, like in 80s, where there's like an all white jury and it's on purpose. It's strange to me. But 1949, it seems like that would be about right. Now, I wasn't sure exactly. I haven't really got there yet. But what do you think about this case? We've got basically one of the alleged perpetrators being killed by like over 400 gunshot. We've got 3. Now, my understanding, and again, haven't done a deep dive on this, and it's not really completely clear based on sort of the history. It's gotten muddled quite a bit. But my understanding was this was almost like a confession, like who's your friend? That doesn't quite do it. Who's your other friend?
Yeah, it like you weren't here, so like we need somebody that was here that and like yeah, it is one of those situations. They have technically like one more in the group here than your normal, like the 3 guys. Here's my take on a lot of these crimes. I'm not saying that no group of Black men never assaulted white women, whatever. These crimes fall into multiple categories, and that's why I don't typically name the victims in these crimes, because I never know unless I really dig in. So one of those categories is it's bullshit. And that means they just made the story up for whatever reason. They wanted some attention. I don't know.
Actually, do you know what the side story to this is?
I don't. Do you?
Yeah, I do. I can tell you.
Oh, tell me the side story on this one, and I'll give you my thoughts.
Okay, so the side story is, and what I mean by that is like the what really happened story. So the victim, so the allegations were that the 17-year-old girl was raped and her husband was beaten very badly. What supposedly actually happened was the husband had hit the wife, and there was no firm evidence that the husband actually had been beaten. There's evidence that a doctor examined the wife and said he couldn't really tell if she'd been raped or not. It came to the attention of the wife's parents that she had been physically she'd been hit by her husband, right?
Okay.
Or she'd been assaulted by her husband. And they made this up to keep the dad from killing the husband, basically.
That's what I was going to go with in terms of how these cases tend to turn out. It's either they made it up, they covered something else up with it, or they did something themselves that they then had to cover up. So I guess the cover up could go a number of ways. Like someone close to them did it, they did it themselves, or like a stranger or someone they didn't want to like get into it with. But it's very rare that we actually have during this time this type of attack. We have a lot of accusations like this. So it does happen that groups of people of one race assault a person of another race, but they're much rarer than people would think if you read an American history book.
Right. And so in this case, the story was that their car had broken down, and the husband and wife's car had broken down, and the guys came along, all four of these guys together, and were going to help with the car. And for whatever reason, they didn't do that. They beat the husband badly, and they took the wife.
Right.
And then after the assault, she got a ride from somebody else, right?
Right.
And this person, I believe it was a man, and I don't know his name, but she got a ride somewhere else, and she never said a word about being raped. She was not upset. There was no indication that she had anything happen to her when she got this ride. There were a lot of flags raised. And so, so as much as a sheriff is a law enforcement position, it is an elected position. I think in Florida,
it's
right?
Heavily political. Yeah, it's definitely.
It's very political. Okay. And so here you've got a situation where, the Deep South in 1949, and a sheriff who was going to be a career sheriff, if at all possible. He could not, I don't even know how to put it, because I don't want to give excuses, but there was no stopping the mob, the lynch mob mentality. There was a lot of deep-seated just hatred. And to hear a black male had attacked a white female.
It just got their redneck racism all up in a knot.
And that's all it was. And it was vicious. And they, the mob mentality really, it took off. And because that was happening, it seems pretty obvious that the sheriff, he knew it was out of control.
Oh, yeah.
Allegedly, it was the wife was kidnapped and assaulted, and the husband was beaten. And so I think it got out of hand even for them, because I believe that 16-year-old Charles Greenlee, I believe that he was the initial one.
Correct.
That came in, and he was coerced and bullied into giving a confession.
Yeah. That
wasn't true, but he had no choice, right? Just how it turns out that, there was a lynch mob waiting. He had no choice. And so I think that it really escalated out of control when they got this young man who, even though he was young, he was already married. And I think his wife was pregnant when this happened. But so you've got a situation where instead of getting her husband in trouble, if this is the way it goes, she tells her parents that she was attacked. And then she was attacked by a black guy. And then she was attacked by 4 black men. And so they get one guy in, and they got to come up with 3 others, right?
Yep.
It got out of hand so quickly that the sheriff couldn't even do anything about it.
Yeah, it took a week for the National Guard to get everything under control.
People took this opportunity to just rage.
Yes.
And they went just absolutely crazy. And under those circumstances, I don't think the intention was to get these 4 guys in trouble. I think that this young girl didn't want her dad
to killing
her husband.
Yep.
Right. And I feel like she never would have done it if she had known what was going to happen. I don't think the gravity of the situation, because the thought process is, I think, your objective is to keep your husband out of trouble with your father.
Right.
And why on earth would they be able to get a 16-year-old kid in there that confesses to this crime that you made up?
Well, we've talked about a couple of those this series. This morning I was talking to a 16-year-old who was part of this. I went to somebody's graduation ceremony for something, and one of the people that was graduating had like multiple children. I was just asking the oldest one, let's say, how old are you? Because I didn't have a good register, and I was shocked that he was 16. And it like suddenly hit me how young and small 16 is. And to think about this kid being beaten by like grown men.
And a lot of them.
A lot of grown men, like at least 4 grown men are involved like early on in this, that I was looking at it and I was like, oh my God, like that is absolutely shocking to me. This case had a lot of repercussions, and then we'll kind of come back to Groveland 4. I think a lot of cases you would find in certain places, a lot of these crimes were not what they looked like on the surface. We're highlighting this case because there is ultimately an exoneration in it. There is a Christmas story here, but it's not a good one. We
did cover that.
Yeah, I was just going to mention it again because I think it needs to like loop back around so people understand. When we talked about this other case a couple years ago,
I think it was the first year we did Christmas, I think.
Yeah, that sounds right. Tying all this back together for a minute. So with Walter Irvin, the NAACP gets involved. And they're convinced from the time these guys are convicted and all this nonsense is happening, they're convinced that like this case is bunk. And like they preserve things that today tell us this case is bunk. And that's how Meg's able to tell you the side story on this. When we look back at it, one of the people that was involved was a guy named Harry Moore, who at the time, he was the executive director of the Florida NAACP. And he organized a campaign to get to the bottom of what had happened to these 3 guys and to the gentleman who was dead. Unfortunately, you have to focus your resources on the living who have been wrongfully convicted, and it's very difficult to deal with the other 4th part of the tragedy. But I bring all of this up because for those of you who haven't connected the dots yet, Willis McCall is involved there. So the appeals are pursued based on the dime and the resources, so the dime and the time, basically the money and the time of the NAACP. In April 1951, the whole reason this wrongful conviction is recognized and ends up moving back for a new trial is because Harry Moore, he puts a team together that includes Thurgood Marshall, who is like a legal legend, literally. And we have this new trial that's about to happen with what we were just describing. Harry Moore took umbrage with the fact that Sheriff McCall has this shooting occur with Shepard and Irvin being wounded, Shepard dying. And Harry Moore says that it is time to suspend Willis McCall from office and indict him. And he gets the FBI and the federal government involved, trying to do something. He even gets Fuller Warren, the Florida governor at the time. He's trying to get him to kick Willis McCall out of office. It's very difficult to get rid of a sheriff that you have. So he does all of this, and the transport that we were just talking about, where this happens and Irvin is able to talk about all of this, happens in November 1951. 6 weeks later, Christmas night, 1951, it is the 25th wedding anniversary for Harry and his wife Harriet, and a bomb goes off beneath their house in Mims, Florida. They die. So Harry dies on the way to the hospital. They had trouble getting him to a hospital. They had to go 30-some miles away. I think they had to go to Sanford to find a hospital that would serve African-American people. His wife dies 2 weeks later. He is considered to be one of the first martyrs in the civil rights movement. He was definitely the first NAACP official who was assassinated by a bomb in the civil rights struggle. They were killed. And it is a huge deal, no matter what color you are or what you believe today. The state of Florida called in the FBI to lead the investigation. The case has never been solved and no one's ever been prosecuted. The FBI chased all these rabbit holes about it having been the Ku Klux Klan or other racist organizations at the time that had committed the bombing. They identified a bunch of suspects, but they were never able to put together enough of a case to bring charges. They did indict a bunch of Klansmen locally, which is people get the idea that that case was solved, that bombing of Harriet and Harry Moore was solved. It wasn't. They indicted them because they had lied about other things they had done. They were hoping that they could bring them in and they would tell the truth. but honestly, most of them didn't crack. Nobody was there to really testify the way that they thought it was going to go. And so they end up having to dismiss even those indictments for different levels of lying to a federal agent and perjury. They closed the investigation in 1953. It's been reopened. I think it's been reopened 5 times. I think online I read somebody say it was 3 times, but I'm pretty sure if you look at the history of the case, it's been reopened 5 times. It comes up in some of the other material that we've been talking about with this case. Ultimately, there's no evidence, but in October 2006, Florida Attorney General, a guy named Charlie Crist, he had reopened it at one point, and he claimed that it was solved. He said that it was these 4 Klansmen. It didn't seem very likely that it was them, but I'll say this. Willis McCall has never been cleared of his possible involvement in that. And he would have been, if you take the big overbearing organizations out of this, because wrapping your head around the concept of the Ku Klux Klan versus the NAACP in 1950s America is a very difficult thing to do. If you remove that, Harry Moore was seeing what was happening to Irvin and then had already seen what had happened to Shepard. And he had already seen that something was wrong with the sheriff. And no matter how you look at this, no matter how you feel about this, there's other evidence that the sheriff did other things like this later in his career. And he got away with it. It is very, very, very likely that a simple motive, like that guy who's a black guy, is trying to get me, sheriff of my county, out of office. He's contacted the governor. He's drugged the FBI into this investigation that I'm closing. And at some point in time, you have to say to yourself, either Willis McCall just has no concept of law enforcement whatsoever and shouldn't be in office and should have been removed because he can't see that this 17-year-old girl has told a lie to keep her 20-year-old husband from being killed by her father, or he is such a terrible person that he is trying to eradicate people for these crimes that they are made up, that he can't see them.
I actually think it got out of hand. I think that the sheriff, but I was saying the mob mentality took over and he really couldn't do anything, but he did take, after Thomas was killed, he did take them and hide them from the lynch mob, right?
Yes, he did.
Okay. And so, that's why I brought up that, sheriff's office is very political. I think that he didn't know what to do. And he was trying to I think he knew the case was dumb, right?
Yeah.
And untrue. And it got way too serious, way too fast. As easy as it was for them to, without anything except coercion and probably physical beating encouragement, which is just bullying, get 4 Black young men indicted and blamed for this crime. I feel like it would have been career suicide for him to stand up for them and say, well, no, they didn't do this and she's lying.
Well,
but the other part where when Irwin and Shepard was killed and Irvin survived, right?
Right.
I'm sure they were not trying to escape.
Oh, yeah, no, they weren't trying to escape. Even if they were, they're not wrong. I don't think they were trying to.
Right. And when I was thinking about it, I was I saw that as a mercy killing because of the warped way that they were thinking back then, right?
It could have been that, but that still doesn't negate the fact that that he's still a terrible sheriff.
It's not. Oh yeah, no, he was awful. Yeah, he was awful. But I think that he had a lot of minions, and I think that minions were.
I thought about that too. The minions being out of control could have been half his problem because if they go down, he goes down, and he has to cover up for the nonsense they're doing.
Or at least not directly call it out, which makes them think they're powerful, right?
Yeah.
And so I imagine you could probably, throw a stone and hit somebody that was involved in the bombing that happened. I mean, I don't think that I think a lot of people knew. And I think it was specifically because it was the executive director of of a Black organization that wants Black people to be considered equal to white people is trying to get the sheriff out of office, right? Yeah. And I feel like that could have been construed a lot of ways. And I have absolutely no doubt that's why a bomb ended up being planted in their house, right? Now, who did it? Well, who knows? But there's no question.
That's the thing that I think made it so difficult. Like, they say those Klan members did it or whatever. Sure, maybe they did. But like, my point is, I feel like the sheriff is probably calling in a favor at that point to keep himself in office. Now, he won't actually be suspended from office till 1972 if you guys want to go down a rabbit hole for Christmas, there's a case of a prisoner there called Tommy Vickers. I think the trial transcripts are online, but ultimately Willis McCall will be tried for second-degree murder in front of an all-white jury in 1973, and he gets found not guilty, and he goes right back to being sheriff until he's finally defeated later that year. So that's another place that this goes. I mean, okay, so this is how they kind of wrap all this up. So first of all, Gilbert King's book is published in 2012. Charles Greenlee died, but he is the only one. He was the youngest of the group. He's the 16-year-old that gets beat first in this instance. He got to see the book, so I wanted to point that out. In 2016, the Lake County Commission and the mayor of Groveland, Tim Lux, they presented the surviving families of the Groveland Four with a posthumous apology. Lux and members of the commission, they began lobbying state lawmakers to do the same. There was a proposal filed, which is called SCR 136, for consideration during the legislative session of 2016 to clear their names. They passed a resolution requesting exoneration for the four men and their families in 2017 through the Florida House of Representatives. The Senate passed a similar or identical, I can't remember, resolution. That was in like a week later. But the call was for Governor Rick Scott at the time to pardon these men. So on January 11th of 2019, the Florida Board of Clemency, they had a new governor, Ron DeSantis, by the time and this rolled around. They agreed to pardon the Groveland Four. And DeSantis does have like a nice little speech he gave about it, but he issued 4 full posthumous pardons. They were not fully exonerated by the state until 2021, and that was through a state's attorney's motion, and a judge granted that motion to fully dismiss the indictments and vacate the convictions in November of 2021. This is one of the most disturbing stories I've ever heard. If you read about it, you hear other cases like it. This is a case that you should ask questions about. One of the things that we've always done from the very beginning, you and I won't cover something unless we have a question about what we're covering. And you're not really hearing us just tell you a story and read a bunch of shit. Although we do read stuff and we pull stuff and we talk about all of this. The reason is because we're trying to answer our own question. And if nobody asks these questions, these cases are forgotten.
Special consideration was given to True Crime Excess by LabRottiCreations.com. If you have a moment in your favorite app, please go on and give us a review or a 5-star rating. It helps us get noticed in the crowd. This is True Crime XS.
Starry skies and Kris Kringles drinking cherry wine. How I wish you were here to stop my Christmas tears. Presents wrapped underneath the tree. Hung the stockings up 1, 2, 3. If it could only be you here with me.
True Crime Excess is brought to you by John and Meg. It's written, produced, edited, and posted by John and Meg. You can always support True Crime Excess through patreon.com, or if you have a story you'd like them to cover, you can reach them at truecrimeaccess.com. Thank you for joining us.
This is just a reminder that we are part of the Zencastr Creator Network, and I put a link in the show notes if you guys want to check it out for your own podcasting needs. I've always enjoyed using Zencastr. Their quality is great, and we were able to join their Creator Network at kind of a key time in their history. I have enjoyed it. I've considered a lot of other places to record and a lot of other ways to put together and host and distribute our podcast. But I've stuck with Zencastr the longest. We've been with them for hundreds of episodes now. And I'm putting a link in the show notes where you can check out what they have to offer and see if it's something you would want to use.